Welcome back. Reflecting on suffering, doubt, and faith can trigger intrusive thoughts. How should Muslims deal with these challenges? And what do we do when we begin to question and doubt our faith? We had the pleasure of sitting down with Maryam Amir at the Being Me Women's Conference to discuss her thoughts on these issues. Maryam received her master's in education from UCLA. She is currently pursuing a second master's degree in Islamic Studies through Azhar University. She studied the Arabic language and memorized the Quran in Cairo, Egypt. She's currently a lecturer with Hikmah Institute. Here is our interview with her now at the Being Me Women's Conference. Maryam, welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to talk about a serious topic, which I'm sure you deal with as well. Why do you think people in North America are going through a crisis of their faith?
Okay, so I think it's very natural as an individual to kind of go through a process of questioning yourself, questioning why I do things and why I believe certain things. And a lot of people are born into a certain faith with their families, and they're raised kind of on that faith. They go to a specific mosque or a church or a temple or a synagogue, et cetera, et cetera. And as somebody continues to grow older and kind of realizes their own life decisions and how that might not necessarily converge with what they've been taught, it kind of causes a person to question whether or not what they've been taught from a faith perspective is really what they want to follow.
Give me an example when you say it doesn't converge with what they've been taught.
So for example, I'll talk about, from the Muslim community, a lot of Muslims, as they, maybe a Muslim went to the mosque while they were growing up, maybe they went to an Islamic school, kind of everything that they were taught was from this generally Muslim perspective. And suddenly they go to college and they go to university, and there are so many people of different walks of life and different lifestyles. And sometimes the pressure to do certain things that they were raised with not necessarily doing, for example, maybe binge drinking. That's not necessarily something that's encouraged within the Muslim community. It's not something that's encouraged within the Muslim community, but suddenly there's this pressure and there's this question of, is this something that I shouldn't involve myself in simply because I was taught that? Do I actually believe that as an individual, as an adult who can now make those decisions on my own?
Or it's even like to different extents, right? I've heard when young people start going to the workforce, you see people drink, and it's sort of like that's the work climate, and you kind of have to do that. So I'm going to social drink. So how do you reconcile those two?
Well, what I would recommend is looking at the issues that come up from a bigger perspective, right? We're all human beings, and we're all going to have questions about how we want to live our lives and whether or not things make sense to us. And sometimes when I come across an issue that might not necessarily feel like it makes sense in my life, I want to look back and think about where this is coming from in the bigger picture. Drinking is just one act, right?
Yeah.
But we have issues like, is there a hereafter? Are there really angels? Is the Quran really from God? Is there really a God? These kind of bigger questions that people grapple with through their lives and really dictate whether or not a person has a feeling of purpose in what they're doing when it comes to their faith. So what I would recommend is somebody really looks at what their faith teaches when it comes to questioning who God is. And I'd love to share something with you that I recommend. So the Quran is a book that talks about prophets of God and how they came to call people to worship God and to call for social justice. And one of the prophets, Prophet Abraham, is someone who was so beloved to Muslims, but somebody who went through a lot of tests. And in the Quran, it talks about how he would call his people, ask his father to think about, who do you worship, and really calling to worshiping God alone. And he saw so many miracles in his life. His town threw him into a hot fire, and God made it cool. He had a child at a very old age. There were a lot of things when his wife was barren. So there were a lot of things that, we would consider miraculous. And yet this prophet of God asks God in the second chapter of the Quran, it's called the cow. He asks God to show him how God raises the dead. And God says to him, don't you believe? And of course God knows that Abraham believes, but he's like, don't you believe? And Abraham responds, of course I believe, but I want my heart to be firm in that belief. And so Abraham's point was, if I were able to see God raise the dead, then I would feel stronger in my faith. And this is a prophet of God. He has seen miracles in his own life. He has been in a fire, and that fire has cooled down because of God's miracle. And yet he still wants something that'll keep his heart firm. So when I hear people who question their faith, I say, look, it doesn't make you a bad person for having doubts. It's not something you should feel guilty about for wondering whether or not this is the truth, or whether or not God is real, or whether or not this is a path you want to follow. And that means different things to different people and different faith groups. But what I would always recommend is look at Abraham's example. We have so much in the Quran that talks to us about life, about science, about how to overcome hardships and how to connect with God. Take a moment to look at what that message is saying and recognize that when you are asking questions about specific issues that come up for you as someone who's questioning your faith, and asking people of knowledge when you're questioning, look at Abraham's example and recognize that your path, God willing, is one that will bring you closer to God, because you're seeking him and trying to find a way in which a relationship with him will be meaningful. And when we do that, the littler things, drinking or doing things that people consider quote unquote inappropriate, those things make sense because it's a bigger picture when it comes to my relationship with God. And if somebody were to involve themselves in those things, then they know who they're turning back to. They know who is watching them, but who's also close to them and who's there when we make mistakes.
So I want to take this conversation to a personal story as well. So I was talking to a friend not too long ago about, this person was struggling with work and work issues. And I said, listen, at the end of the day, do you trust what God has and planned for you or not? And her response to me was, I know I should say yes, and I know the answer should come to me naturally. But she's like, I can't help but wonder why me. So how do you, for someone like that, who, when you're going through disappointment after disappointment, struggle after struggle, how do you build that connection with the Quran? And how do you build, like for someone like you and me, for example, or someone who reads the Quran regularly, that might be an instinctual response. But what would you say to someone who doesn't have isn't there at that level and is dealing with these issues on a day-to-day life, and that's the basis for you questioning, okay, what is Islam? What is why am I a Muslim? So what do you say to that?
I'll share with you something that people talk to me about frequently. For example, a woman came up to me in the mosque after I gave a lecture, and she said that she had a miscarriage, and then soon after she got pregnant, and then that child was a stillbirth. And it's so difficult to lose your child. It's so difficult for anyone who has had a miscarriage or who has had a stillbirth to feel that loss in your womb. And other people don't recognize how painful that is, because it's like, well, thank God, you didn't live with them for so many years. But it is so painful to go through that experience.
Or they say be patient, right? That's a traditional.
Yeah, sure, be patient. Absolutely. And the question that this woman asked is, why does God hate me? Why am I tested? What did I do wrong? And a lot of times when we're tested, we ask, is God punishing me? And in reality, when we know who God is, we recognize that the tests that we go through in our lives are not there to punish us. They're not there because God is angry and he's there to be, punitive and, oh, you did this thing, or you didn't pray, or you didn't do this thing, and therefore you deserve punishment. God forbid. God is the most merciful. And the things that happen in our lives, being able to trust his judgment goes back to knowing who he is. And what I would recommend for someone who doesn't feel like they can trust God's wisdom because they don't feel like they have that connection, I would recommend starting with reading the translation of the Quran on a daily basis. In my own life, I didn't feel connected to God. I doubted whether or not God existed. I doubted whether or not I wanted to be a Muslim. And really reading the Quran in the English translation on a daily basis, just a small amount that I could read with the crazy things I had in my life going on, those were the moments that helped me get through some of the biggest hardships in my life.
Literally the translation, because I think you're the first person who I've ever heard say read the translation, and it'll speak to you.
The Quran was revealed in Arabic to Arabs. It wasn't revealed in Turkish to Arabs. It wasn't revealed in Farsi to Arabs.
That's true.
It was revealed in Arabic for a reason. It's not because Arabic in and of itself as a language is like, yes, linguistically, there's a lot of beautiful things in Arabic that you can't get, for example, in English or in other languages. But it's not like if you and I were speaking in Arabic right now, we'd be like pure or something.
Yeah.
It's funny because there's this like understanding of Arabic being the thing I need to know. You know, the Quran was revealed in Arabic so people could transform and could connect to God. And when it was revealed in Arabic to people who spoke Arabic, it didn't talk about don't do this and don't do that. All it was about was connect to God, remember God, come close to God. There's a hereafter. This life is short and there's an eternity. So when you're going through hardship, put it in that perspective that, you know, God knows what you're going through, and that there is a hereafter, so that the difficulties that we go through in this life, yes, will be a means of blessing in this life. Yes, will be a means of helping us have a new perspective for life as we grow older, but also so that God willing, we can enjoy the hereafter without the pain of this life. And it's very hard for someone to accept that if they don't believe in a hereafter in the first place. But look at it like this. I'll give you a couple of personal examples. When I was in college, I would pray for something specifically over and over, and I never saw the answer to that prayer. And in that same time, I constantly would go through some of the biggest hardships of my life. And then I graduated from college and had some of the biggest blessings of my life, and then was followed with some of the greatest hardships of my life. And all throughout that time, I was praying that same exact prayer, just constantly asking God to give the specific thing to me. And finally, almost 10 years after I originally started making that prayer, I recognized that all of the difficulties that I went through and all the blessings that God blessed me with, it wasn't because it was meant to harm me or push me aside, or because I was sinful, or because it was a punishment. It was literally to shape my life, to answer that prayer at the specific moment that God knew it would be best for my life. And had He answered that prayer in college, it wouldn't have meant anything in comparison to what it means to me right now. So sometimes the hardships that we go through, in that moment, I agree. I know it's so difficult, and I so recommend that someone who is going through hardship see a therapist, seek professional counseling, find support, do self-care. These are all acts of worship. God considers self-care an act of worship. When you make that intention to take care of your mind and your soul and your emotions, it's an act of worship to go to therapy. And also, when we do these things, going back to the Quran in a translation. When I was going through things in school, I'd go home, I'd put my hands up, and I'd say, God, are you even listening to me? And then I'd just close my eyes, I'd open the Quran, I'd point at a random verse, and then I'd open my eyes, and the verse that would come up was, and when my servant asks, وَإِذَا سَأَلَكَ عِبَادِي عَنِّي, when my servants ask you of me, I am near. I listen to everyone who is calling me when that person calls. And I just went through the worst day of my life, and I'm coming home and, oh God, are you even listening to me? To open the Quran, to put my finger on that verse, and to know that He is answering. I'm not just listening to you, I am close. And this is, okay, my personal experience, but it becomes a personal experience when you invest in a relationship with the Quran in a language that you understand. So what I would recommend to the person that you spoke to earlier is seek support in God. Do that through a relationship with the Quran. Read it in a translation that speaks to you. And through that process, know that it can take time. But sometimes years later, we realize that the hardships that happen at a certain point had to happen to open the way for all the other blessings in our lives, to fall into place, to have the specific blessing that is meant for us at a specific time come to fruition at that moment.
I think that's such a beautiful, I don't have words, but that is such a beautiful story to such a complicated question. Thank you so much,
Thank you
Maryam.
for asking.
Hey YouTube, we hope you benefited from this video. If you liked it, or if you didn't, let us know in the comments below. And if you're interested in learning more, check out some of our other videos. And don't forget to subscribe so you can get new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.